In 1952, in a small seminar room at Columbia University in New York City, something unusual happened. A Japanese man, barely 5 feet tall, 81 years old, took a seat before a group of young Americans. He did not raise his voice, he did not perform. He did not hand out a syllabus or gesture at a blackboard. He sat very still, and then he began to speak, slowly, with pauses so long that his students sometimes wondered whether he had fallen asleep. He had not fallen asleep. He was waiting for the silence to become uncomfortable, waiting for the mind's compulsive need to fill empty space to reveal itself, waiting for his students to notice what he was doing before he said a single word about it. Within a few years, those students would go on to reshape the direction of American music, literature, psychology, and spiritual life. The composers in that room would abandon melody, the poets would abandon syntax, the therapists would abandon the talking cure, and all of them, when asked what changed them, would point back to the same source. A quiet old man from Japan who insisted he had nothing to teach. His name was Daisetsu Taitaro Suzuki. Most people in the English-speaking world know him simply as D.T. Suzuki, and for the better part of the 20th century he was the single most influential interpreter of Zen Buddhism the Western world had ever encountered. More than any monk, more than any temple, more than any scripture, it was Suzuki who gave the West its understanding of Zen, the philosophy of emptiness, the practice of sitting still, the idea that enlightenment is not something you earn, but something you already have and have simply forgotten how to see. But here is the part of the story that almost no one tells. Suzuki was not a monk, he was never ordained, he wore no robes in daily life and held no priestly rank. The man the entire Western world treated as the living voice of Zen Buddhism was, technically speaking, a layperson, a scholar, a translator. A man who spent more of his adult life in libraries, seminar rooms, and publishing houses than in meditation halls. And the Zen he brought to the West? It was real. It was rooted in genuine practice and deep scholarship, but it was also his, selected, shaped, emphasized in certain directions and quietly silent in others. He did not lie about Zen, but he edited it, and the version that emerged from those edits became the version the world believes in today. So the question this documentary will try to answer is not a simple one. Did D.T. Suzuki bring Zen to the West, or did he build a new version of it from the ground up? Did he open a window into an ancient tradition, or did he hold up a mirror and let the West see in Zen exactly what it was desperate to find? To answer that, we need to go to a country on the other side of the world that was, at the moment of Suzuki's birth, in the process of tearing itself apart, and a boy who had already begun to learn what it means to have nothing at all. Before we continue, if you find value in documentaries that explore the lives behind the philosophies that shaped the modern world, consider subscribing and leaving a comment below. It helps this channel reach more curious minds. And while you listen tonight, tell me, where in the world are you joining from? Now, let us return to the story. To understand D.T. Suzuki, you first have to understand the Japan he was born into, because the country that produced him was a country at war with itself. In 1868, just 2 years before Suzuki's birth, the Tokugawa shogunate collapsed. For over 2.5 centuries, the Tokugawa shoguns had ruled Japan as a feudal military government, keeping the country sealed off from the outside world in a policy known as sakoku. The emperor in Kyoto was a ceremonial figurehead. The samurai were the ruling class, and Buddhism was woven into every layer of governance, education, and daily life. Temples served as census offices and record keepers. Monks administered local schools. The great Zen monasteries of Kamakura and Kyoto were centers of political influence as much as spiritual practice. Then the Americans arrived. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry sailed 4 warships into Edo Bay and demanded that Japan open its ports to foreign trade. The humiliation was total. Here was a feudal island nation confronted by steam-powered gunships and the industrial might of a civilization it had chosen to ignore for centuries. Within 15 years, the old order had been swept away. The last shogun surrendered his authority. A teenage emperor named Meiji was placed at the center of a radical national project. Japan would modernize. Japan would industrialize. Japan would remake itself in the image of the very Western powers that had humiliated it. The speed of the transformation was staggering. Within a single generation, Japan adopted a Western-style constitution modeled on the Prussian system. Railways and telegraph lines were built at furious pace. The military was restructured along European lines. The brightest students were sent to universities in Berlin, London, and Boston. The samurai class, the military aristocracy that had governed Japan for centuries, was formally abolished. Men who had carried swords since childhood were told to put them down and become clerks and bureaucrats. And then the reformers turned on Buddhism. The movement was called Haibutsu Kishaku. It translates roughly as abolish the Buddha, destroy Shakyamuni. In the early years of the Meiji era, the new government launched a campaign to separate Buddhism from the state and elevate Shinto, the indigenous religion tied to the imperial family, as the official spiritual foundation of the new national order. What began as policy quickly turned violent. Across Japan, temples were ransacked and burned. Statues were smashed. Monks were forced to return to lay life. Sacred texts, some of them centuries old and irreplaceable, were sold as wrapping paper or simply thrown away. In certain provinces, entire Buddhist institutions were erased within a matter of months. This was not a distant persecution happening in some far-off chapter of history. This was not an event that required centuries of hindsight to appreciate. This was the world D.T. Suzuki was born into, the tradition he would spend his life interpreting for the West, the tradition he would carry across the Pacific Ocean and present to audiences who had never encountered it, was at the very moment of his birth under direct and deliberate assault in its own homeland. Japan was devouring its spiritual past in its desperate rush toward an industrial future. And somewhere in a castle town on the northwestern coast, a boy was about to enter a world that had decided, at the highest levels of government, that it no longer had any use for the things he would come to value most. The city of Kanazawa sits on the coast of the Sea of Japan, hemmed between the mountains of the Japanese Alps and the grey waters of the sea. In the late Tokugawa period, it had been the seat of the powerful Maeda clan, rulers of Kaga domain, one of the wealthiest fiefdoms in all of Japan. Its streets were lined with samurai residences, merchant houses, and artisan workshops. Its culture was refined. Kanazawa was a city of gardens, silk dyeing, gold leaf craftsmanship, lacquerwork, and the quiet cultivation of taste. It was said that if Kyoto was the spiritual capital of Japan, Kanazawa was its aesthetic mirror. Smaller, but no less proud of what it had made. Taitaro Suzuki was born here on the 11th of November 1870. His family belonged to the samurai class, or more precisely, they had belonged to it. The Meiji reforms had stripped families like the Suzukis of their hereditary status and government stipends just a few years before his birth. They kept the bearing, they kept the expectations and the codes of conduct that had governed samurai households for generations. But the income was gone. The swords were gone. The social structure that had given their lives meaning was being dismantled around them. His father, Ryojin Suzuki, was a physician who practiced traditional medicine rooted in Chinese and Japanese herbal traditions. He was, by the accounts that survive, a thoughtful and educated man. He treated patients in Kanazawa and the surrounding area using methods that had been passed down through generations of practitioners. But he was also unwell. When Taitaro was only 6 years old, Ryojun died. The family fell apart financially. Taitaro's mother, Masu, was left to raise several children alone in a household that had already been struggling under the weight of the new era. There was no safety net, no pension, no inheritance of any significance. The Suzukis went from genteel poverty to genuine hardship almost overnight. Meals were scarce. Winters in Kanazawa were bitter, with heavy snow blowing in off the Sea of Japan. The cold found its way through every gap in the old wooden house. This matters. It matters profoundly. Because the man who would become the world's foremost teacher of Buddhist detachment from material suffering did not arrive at that philosophy through comfort or abstract curiosity. He arrived at it through the experience of actual deprivation. He knew what it was to be hungry. He knew what it felt like when the adults in the house spoke in low voices about money. He knew what it meant to lose the person who held the world together and to watch the world come apart in the absence. Emptiness was not an abstraction for the boy from Kanazawa. It was the shape of every room his father was no longer in. It was the sound of his mother working late into the night doing labor that a samurai's wife was never supposed to do. Masu held the family together. She made sure her children received an education even when there was barely enough rice to go around. Taitaro attended local schools in Kanazawa, where he proved to be a sharp and serious student. He had a particular gift for languages. English, still a rare and highly prized skill in Meiji Japan, came to him naturally. He devoured books with an appetite that went beyond academic diligence. He was searching for something in those pages, though he could not yet name what it was. But Masu's own health was failing. She would not survive to see what her son became. And before grief could harden into bitterness in the young man's bones, something else would reach him first. A letter from an old schoolmate, an invitation to a temple in the hills south of Tokyo, and a practice that did not promise to explain suffering but to sit inside it until the one who suffers disappears. Suzuki's formal education followed the path that Meiji Japan had laid out for its brightest young men. He left Kanazawa and traveled to Tokyo, where he enrolled at a preparatory school that would later become Waseda University. The school was part of the new wave of Western-style institutions that were reshaping Japanese intellectual life. Suzuki studied English and philosophy. He showed aptitude for both. The instructors noticed a young man who asked questions that went beyond the material being presented. He wanted to know not just what European philosophers had argued, but why they argued the way they did. What assumptions lived underneath the arguments. Later, he attended Tokyo Imperial University as a special student, meaning he could sit in on lectures and access the library but would not receive a formal degree. The arrangement was common for students who lacked the financial resources to enroll fully. Money, as always, was the constraint. The university introduced him to Western philosophy in a systematic way for the first time. He read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. He studied Hegel's dialectic. He encountered the language of logic, epistemology, and metaphysics that European thinkers had been refining for centuries. He found it impressive. The architecture of these systems was formidable. Every concept supported the next, like bricks in a cathedral wall. And yet he also found it somehow enclosed. Something in the Western approach to knowledge struck him as a closed room. Every question led to another concept. Every concept led to another argument. And the arguments, however sophisticated, never arrived anywhere that felt like solid ground. They arrived at more arguments. He was not the first person to feel this way about Western philosophy. But he was unusual in knowing, even at that young age, that another approach existed. Buddhism had been part of his world since childhood, not as a discipline, not as a daily practice, but as a presence in the air of Kanazawa. The temples, battered as they were by the Meiji reforms, still stood. The ideas behind them still circulated in the culture like a river running underground, even when the surface had been paved over with Western concrete. What changed everything was a letter. An older schoolmate from Kanazawa, a young man who had already begun practicing at a Zen monastery, wrote to Suzuki about what he was experiencing. The discipline of zazen, seated meditation, the hours of stillness, and the confrontation with koans, those impossible riddles that Zen masters had used for centuries to shatter the comfortable habits of the thinking mind. A monk asks the master a question. The master answers with something that makes no logical sense, and the student is told to hold that senseless answer in the mind and sit with it until the mind that holds it gives way. This was not philosophy as the university taught it. This was philosophy that demanded you stop philosophizing. That told you the mind itself, the very instrument of analysis and reason, was the obstacle, and that the only way past it was through. Suzuki felt something shift inside him as he read that letter. By 1891 he had made his decision. He left Tokyo and travelled south to the coastal city of Kamakura, where the great Rinzai Zen temple of Engaku-ji sat in the forested hills above the town. He arrived with no money, no connections, and no credentials that would have meant anything to the monks inside. He presented himself at the gate and asked to be admitted. He was 20 years old, thin, poor, desperate in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. What he found inside those walls was a master who would hand him a single word and tell him not to leave until that word had destroyed everything he thought he understood. Engaku-ji was not just any temple. Founded in 1282 under the patronage of the regent Hojo Tokimune, it was one of the Gozan, the 5 great Zen temples of Kamakura, a designation that carried centuries of spiritual and political weight. The monastery had been established to honor the Japanese soldiers who had died repelling the Mongol invasions, and from its earliest days it had been intertwined with the warrior culture of medieval Japan. Its buildings were arranged along a gentle slope in the hills, surrounded by groves of cedar and bamboo. The air smelled of incense, damp wood, and the salt carried inland from Sagami Bay. Bells marked the hours. The sound of chanting drifted between the wooden halls in the early morning darkness. When Suzuki arrived in 1891, the temple was led by Imagita Kozen, a revered Rinzai Zen master whose reputation for severity and depth drew serious practitioners from across Japan. Kozen was an old man by then, near the end of a long life spent in monastic discipline. He accepted the young man from Kanazawa as a student. But the terms of that acceptance carry a distinction that is critical to the entire story, and it is one that most Western admirers of Suzuki have never fully absorbed. Suzuki did not take monastic vows. He did not shave his head. He was not ordained as a priest. He entered Engaku-ji as what Zen tradition calls a koji, a serious lay practitioner. Someone who follows the discipline, rises before dawn to sit in meditation, confronts the koans alongside the monks, but does not join the priesthood, does not enter the institutional hierarchy, remains, in the eyes of the tradition, an outsider who practices from the inside. He would remain a layperson for the rest of his life. He never changed this status. The man the entire English-speaking world would come to regard as the embodiment of Zen Buddhism held no clerical rank whatsoever. He was, in the most literal and technical sense, not a Zen priest, not a Zen monk, not a Zen master in any formal institutional sense. He was a devoted practitioner who happened to write brilliantly about what he practiced, and the world, not knowing the distinction, treated his authority as absolute. Imagita Kozen died in January of 1892, barely a year after Suzuki's arrival. Leadership of Engaku-ji passed to Kozen's Dharma heir, a younger and more internationally minded master named Soen Shaku. Shaku was unusual among Japanese Zen teachers of his generation. He had travelled to Southeast Asia. He read some English. He was curious about the wider world in a way that most of his contemporaries were not. He had a sense, perhaps intuitive, that Zen's future lay not only in its Japanese monasteries, but in its encounter with civilizations beyond Japan's shores. Shaku saw something in the young man from Kanazawa, an intensity that bordered on desperation, the kind of urgency that monastic life cannot manufacture and comfortable seekers rarely possess. Shaku became Suzuki's primary teacher, and the first thing he gave his new student was a problem that was designed to be unsolvable. He assigned Suzuki the koan that had broken students for centuries, a single syllable, the most famous word in all of Zen, and Suzuki would sit with it in poverty and silence for years. A monk once approached the great Tang dynasty master, Zhaozhou Kongshen, known in Japan as Joshu. The question was simple, almost naive. Does a dog have Buddha nature? In Mahayana Buddhist teaching, all sentient beings possess Buddha nature. The answer, doctrinally, is yes. Every tradition within Mahayana Buddhism affirms this. It is one of the most fundamental principles of the entire philosophy. The correct answer is obvious. Joshu's answer was something else entirely. Mu. The word means no, or nothing, or not, or none. But in the context of koan practice, it means none of these things. It is not a proposition to be debated. It is not a concept to be analyzed. It is not even, really, a word. It is a wall. The student is told to take this single syllable and hold it in the mind, not to think about it, not to search for hidden meanings, not to construct an interpretation, simply to sit with mu, to breathe mu, to become mu, until the mind that tries to understand it can no longer sustain its own effort and collapses under the weight of its own grasping. Suzuki sat with mu for years. The accounts of this period, drawn from his own later writings and from the testimony of those who knew him, describe a young man in genuine anguish. He was poor. The monastery provided simple food and a place to sleep, but the practice demanded everything else. Hours upon hours of seated meditation, legs burning, back aching, the mind spinning in frantic circles around a syllable that refused to yield any meaning. Soyen Shaku was not gentle about it. When Suzuki came forward with what he thought were insights, Shaku rejected them. Again, and again, and again. Every answer was wrong because every answer came from the very thing that mu was designed to destroy. The thinking, grasping, pattern-seeking, meaning-making mind. Suzuki later described his state during these years with unusual honesty. He spoke of confusion so total that he could not tell whether he was moving forward or simply losing his sanity. He described a sense of being trapped between the impossibility of solving the koan and the impossibility of abandoning it. He sat with mu through the Kamakura winters, through the humid summers when the mosquitoes were relentless, through the ringing of the temple bells and the long silence between them. And then, around 1895 or 1896, something happened. The Zen tradition calls it kensho, a seeing into one's own nature. Not a vision, not a trance, not an emotional experience, though emotion may follow. It is described, by those who claim to have had it, as the sudden falling away of the boundary between the one who looks and the thing being looked at. The moment when the separation between self and world, which feels so solid and so permanent, reveals itself to have been an illusion all along. Not a belief that it is an illusion, not an intellectual argument that it might be. A direct, immediate, non-conceptual seeing. As obvious and as irrefutable as the color of the sky. Soyen Shaku confirmed the experience. Whatever happened in that moment, whatever it was, Shaku judged it genuine. But here is the thing that would haunt the rest of Suzuki's life, and that drives this documentary to its final frame. Kensho, by its very nature, cannot be put into words. The moment you describe it, you have already moved away from it. Language is a tool of distinction, of separation, of one thing being different from another. And Kensho is the collapse of distinction itself. The finger pointing at the moon, as the old Zen saying goes, is not the moon. Suzuki knew this. Every Zen teacher who ever lived knew this, and yet he would spend the next 60 years writing about it. Book after book, essay after essay, lecture after lecture, choosing words for the wordless, building sentences about the dissolution of the mind that builds sentences, trying, with extraordinary skill and relentless determination, to say what cannot be said. The question the rest of his life would pose, and that scholars are still arguing about more than a century later, was already forming in that monastery in the hills of Kamakura. If this experience cannot be captured in language, then what exactly was D.T. Suzuki doing when he wrote about it, and who was he writing for? In 1893, while Suzuki was still sitting with Mu in Kamakura, something happened on the other side of the Pacific that would eventually redirect his entire life. The city of Chicago was hosting the World's Columbian Exposition, a massive international fair celebrating the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas. The fairgrounds along Lake Michigan covered more than 600 acres. Nearly 30 million visitors passed through its gates over 6 months. Alongside the main exhibition, with its displays of industrial progress and national achievement, the organizers convened an ambitious side event, the World's Parliament of Religions. It was the first major gathering of its kind. For the first time in modern history, representatives of the world's major faiths assembled under one roof to address a Western audience. Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, Muslims, Taoists, Confucians, and representatives of indigenous spiritual traditions stood at podiums in the Art Institute of Chicago and spoke to crowds of Americans who had never heard a non-Christian religious leader speak in person. The most famous participant was Swami Vivekananda, the Indian Hindu monk, whose electrifying speeches introduced Vedanta philosophy to the American mainstream. But the Buddhist delegates made a quieter and perhaps more enduring impression. Among them was Soyen Shaku, Suzuki's teacher from Engaku-ji. Shaku delivered a paper titled The Law of Cause and Effect as Taught by Buddha. It was written in Japanese. The English translation had been prepared by his young lay student back in Kamakura, D.T. Suzuki. It was one of the first formal presentations of Zen Buddhist thought to an American audience, and though its impact at the time was modest compared to Vivekananda's oratory, it planted a seed that would take decades to flower. In the audience that day sat a man named Paul Carus. Carus was a German-born philosopher who had emigrated to the United States and settled in the small river town of LaSalle, Illinois, where he ran the Open Court Publishing Company. Carus was consumed by a single intellectual obsession. He believed that religion and science could be reconciled, that beneath the surface differences of the world's spiritual traditions lay a common rational core. He saw in Eastern philosophy, and in Buddhism in particular, a potential bridge between ancient wisdom and modern scientific thought. Shaku's presentation impressed him deeply. Over the next few years, Carus and Shaku maintained a correspondence. Carus needed a collaborator, someone who could translate Buddhist texts from Sanskrit, Chinese, and Japanese into English with philosophical precision. Someone with the linguistic ability and the depth of training to render ideas that had no precedent in the Western vocabulary, not just the words, but the architecture of thought behind the words, the flavor and texture and weight of concepts that had been refined over 1,000 years in languages that mapped the mind differently than any European tongue. Shaku recommended his student, the young man who had translated his Parliament paper, the young man who had recently experienced Kensho at Engaku-ji and who was now searching for what to do with the rest of his life. In 1897, D.T. Suzuki boarded a ship and crossed the Pacific Ocean. He was 26 years old. He had never left Japan. He spoke functional but imperfect English. He carried almost nothing with him, and he was heading to a small town in the middle of the American heartland to do something no one had ever attempted at this scale. LaSalle, Illinois, sat along the Illinois River in the flat agricultural center of the country. It was a town of grain elevators, church steeples, and wide streets that turned to mud in the spring rains. Winters were brutal. Summers were thick with humidity and the sound of cicadas. The nearest major city was Chicago, roughly 80 miles to the northeast. It was, in every conceivable way, the opposite of Kamakura. Suzuki moved into a room above the open court publishing offices and began working as Paul Caruse's editorial assistant, translator, and intellectual partner. For the next 12 years, this would be his world. Not a monastery, not a university lecture hall, a small publishing house in the rural Midwest, surrounded by cornfields and Protestant churches. The work was painstaking. Suzuki translated The Awakening of Faith in the Mahayana, one of the foundational texts of East Asian Buddhist philosophy, into English. He worked on portions of the Lankavatara Sutra. He translated the Tao Te Ching. He edited manuscripts, proofread galleys, corrected typesetting errors, and wrote articles and reviews for Caruse's philosophical journals. The labor was meticulous and often tedious, the kind of work that requires a patience bordering on devotion. But translation was only part of what was happening. Suzuki was also reading everything: William James on the varieties of religious experience, Swedenborg on spiritual perception, Meister Eckhart on the via negativa, the theological path of approaching God through negation, Hegel on the dialectic of spirit, the Transcendentalists, Emerson, Thoreau. He consumed Western philosophy and theology with the methodical thoroughness of a doctor studying a patient, not to become Western, not to abandon his own tradition, but to understand what the Western mind was missing and how to speak to that absence in language the West could hear. The years in LaSalle were not dramatic. They were profoundly quiet. But they were transformative in a way that drama could never achieve, because in that small room above the printing press, Suzuki was being forced to do something no Zen practitioner in the history of the tradition had ever done before. He had to think about his own tradition from the outside. To translate a Buddhist concept into English, you must first decide what it means. Not what it means in the abstract, but what it means precisely enough to survive the crossing from one language to another. And then you must choose which English word comes closest, and every choice you make is an interpretation, an emphasis, a slight bending of the original towards something the new audience can receive. The Japanese word satori does not mean exactly the same thing as the English word enlightenment. But once Suzuki used enlightenment as its nearest equivalent, that equation became permanent in the Western imagination. He was not merely transferring information from one container to another. He was constructing a vocabulary, and through that vocabulary, word by careful word, he was constructing a worldview. The entire English-speaking world's understanding of Zen Buddhism would be built on choices made in that room in Illinois. This raises a question that will follow Suzuki for the rest of his life and well beyond it. When a single person selects the words through which an entire tradition enters a new language, is that translation, or is it something closer to authorship? The answer depends on how much you trust the translator. And Suzuki, whatever else he was a man with his own convictions about what mattered most. In 1907, while still working with Carus in LaSalle, Suzuki published his first major English language book, Outlines of Mahayana Buddhism. He was 36 years old. The book was ambitious in scope and unusual in posture. It attempted to present the entire Mahayana Buddhist tradition to a Western readership in a single coherent volume. Mahayana, the great vehicle, is the branch of Buddhism that spread from India through Central Asia into China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. It encompasses an enormous range of schools, texts, and philosophical systems. Suzuki covered the bodhisattva ideal, the concept of the being who delays personal liberation in order to guide all sentient beings toward awakening. He explained sunyata, emptiness, the Mahayana teaching that all phenomena lack inherent independent existence. He walked his readers through the philosophical frameworks of the Yogacara school, which analyzes consciousness, and the Madhyamaka school, which systematizes the logic of emptiness. He discussed the relationship between samsara, the cycle of suffering, and nirvana, the release from it, and presented the Mahayana insight that these are not two separate things, but two ways of seeing the same reality. It was dense, careful work. But what made the book distinctive was not its content. It was its voice. Suzuki did not write as an anthropologist cataloguing an exotic foreign religion. He did not write as a native informant explaining his culture's curiosities to outsiders. He wrote as a philosopher presenting a coherent worldview that he believed could stand alongside and in certain important respects surpass anything the Western philosophical tradition had produced. There was no apology in his prose, no deference, no sense that Buddhism needed Western permission to be taken seriously. He treated Mahayana philosophy as philosophy, period, not Eastern philosophy, not mystical philosophy, not pre-modern philosophy. Philosophy that happened to have been developed in Asia and that the West had been too provincial to notice. The book received respectful attention in academic circles, though it did not reach a popular audience. Very few works of comparative philosophy did in 1907. The readership for such a book was measured in hundreds, not thousands, but its real significance was strategic. It established Suzuki as something the English-speaking world had never quite encountered before, an intellectual who could read Kant in German and the Lankavatara Sutra in Sanskrit and classical Chinese, and who moved between these traditions with the confidence of someone who belonged to all of them. There was, however, a subtler move at work in the book. Suzuki presented Zen as the highest expression of Mahayana Buddhist thought. Not one school among many, not a regional variation, but the pinnacle, the tradition that had stripped away everything unnecessary and arrived at the living core of what the Buddha had actually taught. This was not a neutral scholarly observation, it was an argument. And it was an argument that privileged his own school, Rinzai Zen, above all others. Back in Japan, some Buddhist scholars noticed that Suzuki's version of Buddhism placed Zen at the summit, the Pure Land traditions with their emphasis on devotion and faith, the esoteric Shingon school with its elaborate rituals and mandalas, the philosophical Tendai tradition, all present in his account, but none occupying the highest position. That belonged to Zen, and specifically to the Zen of individual experience, of koans, of sudden awakening, Suzuki's Zen. It was the first clear sign that D.T. Suzuki was not simply explaining Buddhism to the West. He was making a case for a specific version of it, and he was making that case to an audience that had no way of knowing the difference. In 1909, after 12 years in America, Suzuki returned to Japan. He was 38 years old. He had spent his entire adult life either in monastic poverty at Engaku-ji or in a publishing house in rural Illinois. He had produced serious scholarship. He had learned to think in English, to dream in it, to construct arguments in it with a fluency that most native speakers would envy. But he had not yet built the life that would sustain the decades of work ahead of him. He took a position teaching English at the Gakushwine, the peers' school in Tokyo. It was a prestigious institution that educated children of the Japanese aristocracy. The Meiji reforms had replaced the old feudal hierarchy with a new Western-style peerage, and the Gakushuan existed to prepare the sons and daughters of this new elite for their roles in modern Japanese society. For Suzuki, the position was practical, it was stable, it paid enough to live on, and it gave him time, in the hours between classes, to read and write. It was during this period that he met Beatrice Erskine Lane. Beatrice was American. She had graduated from Radcliffe College, the women's coordinate institution of Harvard. She came from an educated cosmopolitan background. She was a theosophist, meaning she was already immersed in the Western esoteric tradition that sought universal spiritual truths beneath the surface of all religions. She was also a serious student of Mahayana Buddhism in her own right. She had come to Japan not as a tourist or a casual seeker, but as a scholar with genuine intellectual purpose. She read. She argued. She pushed back. She was articulate, independent, and fearless in a way that Suzuki found both challenging and necessary. They married in 1911. The union was unconventional by nearly every standard that mattered in Meiji-era Japan. An American woman and a Japanese man. A Radcliffe graduate and a scholar who had never completed a university degree. A theosophist and a Zen practitioner. The social gap between them was wide enough that some of Suzuki's colleagues and acquaintances viewed the marriage with outright disapproval. He seemed not to care. Together they built something rare. A marriage that was also an intellectual partnership. In 1921 they co-founded The Eastern Buddhist, an English-language journal that would become one of the most important publications in the field for decades. The journal published articles on Buddhist philosophy, history, and practice. It reached scholars, seekers, and intellectuals across Europe, America, and Asia. It was rigorous but accessible. It treated Buddhism as a living tradition, not a museum exhibit. Beatrice was not a silent partner in any of this. She edited Suzuki's English with the eye of someone who understood both the language and the audience. She wrote articles of her own. She pushed back on his drafts when she thought they were unclear, too dense, or too insular. She understood what Western readers needed to hear and, more importantly, how they needed to hear it. She was his bridge to the English-speaking mind in a way that went beyond grammar or vocabulary. She understood the rhythms of Western thought from the inside. They adopted a son together, a boy named Victor. Their home in Japan became a gathering point for scholars, translators, and spiritual travelers from both sides of the Pacific. But here is the fact that the narrative cannot let go of, because the story will return to it with the full weight of everything that follows. Beatrice was the person who understood Suzuki best. Not his students, not his readers, not the monks at Engaku-ji. Beatrice. And in less than 3 decades she would be gone. And the man who had devoted his life to teaching that suffering arises from attachment would discover that knowing this as a philosophical truth and living it as a bereaved husband are two things separated by an ocean wider than the Pacific. In 1921, the same year he and Beatrice launched the Eastern Buddhist, Suzuki accepted a professorship at Otani University in Kyoto. He would remain there for decades, and the position anchored him at the intersection of 3 worlds that no other person alive occupied simultaneously. The first was traditional Japanese Zen. Kyoto was the spiritual and cultural heart of Japanese Buddhism. The great temple complexes of Daitoku-ji, Myoshin-ji, and Nanzen-ji dominated entire neighborhoods. Rinzai Zen was a living institution here, with its own hierarchies, rituals, financial interests, and internal politics. Monks trained for years. Abbots wielded significant cultural authority. The second was academic Buddhist scholarship. Otani University was affiliated not with Zen, but with the Jodo Shinshu tradition, true Pure Land Buddhism. This was a devotional school quite different from Zen. Its emphasis was not on meditation or koans, but on faith in Amida Buddha. Suzuki's colleagues at Otani were rigorous textual scholars who read Sanskrit, Pali, Tibetan, and classical Chinese. They viewed Buddhism as a subject of historical and philological analysis, not primarily as a vehicle for personal awakening. The third was the growing Western appetite for Eastern thought. Letters arrived regularly from Europe and America. Scholars, writers, artists, psychologists, all of them asking Suzuki to explain, to clarify, to translate some aspect of Buddhist thought into terms the Western mind could grasp. He moved through these three worlds with a freedom that made people in each of them slightly uneasy. The Zen monks found it strange that this man, this layperson who had never been ordained, was becoming the tradition's most visible international representative. His scholarship was respected. His dedication was not questioned. But his lack of institutional standing rankled. In the traditional hierarchy of Japanese Zen, authority flows through lineage, through formal Dharma transmission from master to student, through decades spent within the monastic system, eating the monastery's food, sweeping the monastery's floors, submitting to the monastery's discipline. Suzuki had bypassed all of this. He had walked a path entirely his own, and now he was speaking for a tradition that had never authorized him to speak. The academic scholars at Otani had their own reservations. His English language writing was too popular, too experiential, too willing to sacrifice philological precision for emotional resonance and narrative impact. A scholar's proper task, they believed, was to analyze texts carefully and honestly, not to advocate for the transformative power of a tradition, as though the university classroom were a pulpit. And the Western seekers who wrote to him from London, Paris, New York, and San Francisco had no idea that any of these tensions existed. They had never heard of Jodo Shinshu or Otani University or the institutional politics of Japanese Buddhism. They read his books and assumed they were receiving Zen itself, pure and unmediated, from a recognized authority. Suzuki appeared unbothered by the contradictions of his position. Perhaps years of koan practice had taught him to inhabit paradox comfortably. Or perhaps he simply judged that the work mattered more than the opinions of those who questioned his right to do it. From this quiet perch in Kyoto, surrounded by cherry blossoms in spring and the sound of temple bells drifting over the rooftops, Suzuki was about to produce the works that would define him forever. Works that would determine how the entire English-speaking world understood Zen for generations to come. Whether that understanding was accurate is a question that scholars are still fighting over. Between 1927 and 1934, Suzuki published 3 volumes that changed the direction of religious thought in the English-speaking world. The Essays in Zen Buddhism. First series in 1927. Second series in 1933. Third series in 1934. These were not academic treatises written for specialists. They were acts of persuasion. Suzuki wrote in flowing, vivid English prose that made complex Buddhist philosophy feel urgent, dramatic, and alive. He told stories of the ancient Chinese Chan masters, the spiritual ancestors of Japanese Zen, masters who shouted at their students, masters who answered sincere questions with a slap across the face, masters who cut a cat in half to illustrate a point about non-attachment, then held up the bloody knife and asked the assembled monks what they had learned. These stories, drawn from classical Chinese Zen literature, had been circulating within Buddhist monasteries for centuries. Suzuki was the first person to bring them into English with the narrative skill of a born storyteller. He described koan practice not as an intellectual exercise or a puzzle to be solved, but as a form of deliberately induced psychological crisis. The student receives a koan from the master, a question that has no logical answer. The student sits with it, Days, weeks, months, years. The mind throws answer after answer at the wall, and each one is rejected. The student grows desperate, frustrated, exhausted. And at the breaking point, when the mind has finally exhausted every resource it has, something gives way. The mind that was trying to solve the koan was itself the obstacle, and when it collapses, what remains is satori, direct seeing, the thing that was always there, hidden behind the machinery of thought. Suzuki wrote about satori as the central, defining experience of Zen. Not gradual self-improvement, not scholarly learning, not moral cultivation, not devotion to a deity. A sudden, total, irreversible shift in the way reality is perceived. He made it sound both terrifying and irresistible, and he made a series of arguments, some explicit and some carried implicitly in the way he structured his material, that would shape how the West understood Zen for the next century. First, Zen is not a religion in the way the West understands religion. It has no creed, no dogma, no required belief. It is, at its core, an experience. Second, that experience is universal. It is the same thing Meister Eckhart described in medieval Germany, the same thing William James catalogued in his landmark study. Zen simply has the most refined method for reaching it. Third, the primary obstacle to this experience is not sin, not ignorance, not insufficient devotion. The obstacle is the rational, conceptualizing mind itself. The Western habit of analyzing, categorizing, and reducing everything to a concept is precisely what prevents the direct seeing that Zen points toward. These arguments landed in the English-speaking world with enormous force. Intellectuals disillusioned with organized Christianity found a tradition that required no faith in the supernatural. Artists who felt constrained by rationalism found permission to trust intuition and spontaneity. Therapists who sensed that the ego was more prison than palace found a tradition that had been dissolving egos for 1,000 years. But here is what the readers could not see. Suzuki was selecting. Every tradition contains multitudes. Zen Buddhism in Japan included elaborate rituals, hierarchical temple structures, ethical precepts, funeral rites, and community obligations that governed ordinary monks and laypeople alike. Suzuki mentioned some of this. He emphasized almost none of it. What he placed in the foreground was the dramatic, the experiential, the individual, the master and the student alone in a room, the koan and the breakthrough, the lightning strike of satori. He was not lying. Everything he described was part of the tradition. But by choosing what to illuminate and what to leave in shadow, he was engaged in something more ambitious than translation. He was designing, and the Zen that emerged from his design was something that had never quite existed in this precise form before. Not in China, not in Japan, not in Korea. Only in English, only in his English. The essays made Suzuki famous. They also made Zen famous, or at least a version of it. But fame has a way of outrunning the person who earned it, and even as his books were being read in London, Berlin, and New York, something was happening in Japan that would force Suzuki into the most troubling chapter of his entire life. In 1938, Suzuki published what many scholars consider his most beautiful and most problematic book, Zen and Japanese Culture. Originally titled Zen Buddhism and Its Influence on Japanese Culture, it made a sweeping and seductive argument that Zen was not merely one religion among several in Japan. It was the hidden pulse beneath every great Japanese art form, the invisible thread connecting the country's most celebrated cultural achievements across centuries. The tea ceremony, with its ritualized simplicity and its insistence that beauty emerges from restraint. Flower arrangement, where the placement of a single branch in a vase is treated as an act of profound attention. Ink painting, in which the artist must execute the brushstroke in a single, unrepeatable motion, because the ink on rice paper allows no correction. Haiku poetry, with its compression of an entire experience into 17 syllables. No theatre, where masked performers move with an almost supernatural slowness that makes the passage of time itself visible. The design of Japanese gardens, where rocks and moss and water are arranged to create landscapes that appear to have existed forever, untouched by human hands. Architecture, with its reverence for natural materials and empty space. And swordsmanship, the art of the blade, the discipline that ties the warrior's body to the warrior's mind to the moment of action. Suzuki moved through each of these with grace, erudition, and a love for his subject that radiated from every page. He showed how the Zen emphasis on emptiness, spontaneity, and direct perception had shaped the aesthetic foundations of Japanese civilization. He argued that the tea master's stillness and the painter's single brushstroke both emerged from the same source, a mind emptied of clutter, a consciousness freed from the need to plan, to judge, to impose meaning on what is simply there. The book was gorgeous. It remains one of the most widely read works of cultural interpretation ever published about Japan. Western readers received it with fascination. It gave them a framework for understanding Japanese art that felt both profoundly foreign and strangely accessible. The idea that a spiritual practice could produce an entire aesthetic civilization was intoxicating. But the book had a shadow, and the shadow was timing. By equating Zen with the essence of Japanese culture, Suzuki was making a claim that elevated Japan above every other Buddhist civilization. Korea had its own Zen tradition called Seon. China had Chan, the very school from which Japanese Zen descended. Vietnam had Thien. All of these traditions shared roots with what Suzuki described. But in his telling, it was Japan that had brought the tradition to its highest and most refined expression. This was not a neutral scholarly observation, it was a cultural argument dressed in aesthetic clothing. And in 1938, cultural arguments about Japanese uniqueness and superiority carried a very specific political charge. Japan had invaded Manchuria in 1931. It had launched full-scale war against China in 1937. The ideology of Japanese exceptionalism was no longer a topic for university seminars. It was the engine of imperial expansion. It was the language of soldiers and generals. Suzuki did not write propaganda. Zen and Japanese Culture is not a nationalist tract, but it was published in the same year that Japanese soldiers committed mass atrocities in Nanjing, and the question of what Zen had to do with the sword was about to become something far more urgent than an exercise in cultural history. Of all the concepts Suzuki introduced to the English-speaking world, none travelled further, embedded itself more deeply, or carried a sharper double edge than Mushin. No mind. The idea has roots that reach back through centuries of Zen literature, but Suzuki drew most heavily on the writings of Takuan Soho, a 17th-century Zen master who had composed a famous series of letters to the swordsman Yagyu Munenori. Takuan's letters are among the most celebrated texts in the history of Japanese martial arts, and their argument is deceptively simple. The greatest obstacle to mastery in any art, Takuan wrote, including the art of the sword, is the mind's tendency to fix itself on a single point. When a swordsman faces an opponent, his mind wants to focus on the opponent's blade, on the opponent's stance, on the next move or the move after that. But the moment the mind fixes itself on any one of these things, it stops moving. It becomes stuck. And a stuck mind in combat is a fatal liability. Because the opponent who acts without fixation, who responds to the moment as it unfolds rather than following a plan, will always be faster, always be more fluid, always arrive before the thinking mind can catch up. Suzuki took this martial principle and expanded it into a general philosophy of consciousness. No mind, as he articulated it for Western readers, was not the absence of awareness. Far from it. It was the presence of a different kind of awareness, one that operates without the constant interference of conceptual thought, without the running commentary of self-consciousness, without the distinction between the one who acts and the action itself, the painter whose brush moves without deliberation, the musician whose fingers find the note before the conscious mind can name it, the archer who draws the bow, holds, and releases the string without deciding to release it. The archer does not aim. The arrow finds the target because there is no separation between archer, bow, arrow, and target. They are one event, not four separate things connected by intention. Suzuki connected no mind to Satori. The breakthrough experience shatters the barrier between the self that observes and the world that is observed. Once that barrier falls, action becomes spontaneous, not impulsive, not random, spontaneous in the deepest sense, arising from a source that precedes the division of experience into subject and object. The Western world was electrified by this concept. It gave precise language to something that athletes, artists, performers, and craftspeople had always sensed but had never been able to articulate. The experience of being so absorbed in an activity that the sense of a separate doer temporarily vanishes. The psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi would later name this state flow and build an entire field of research around it. But Suzuki had described the same territory decades earlier in terms that were both more precise and more radical. Because for Suzuki, no mind was not a peak performance state that special people achieve under special conditions. It was the natural condition of all human consciousness, the ordinary way the mind operates when it is not being obstructed by the habit of thinking about itself. But here is where the shadow falls. If no mind means acting without the interference of moral deliberation, if it means responding to each moment without the hesitation that ethical judgment requires, then the concept contains a door that opens onto darkness. The swordsman who strikes without thinking is free from hesitation, but he is also free from guilt, free from the weight of knowing that the body falling before him was a person, and in a country that was, at that very moment, building an army on the principle that good soldiers are those who obey without question, who act without the interference of individual conscience. The idea of a mind beyond moral thought was not merely philosophical, it was extremely useful. If no mind describes the ongoing state of an awakened consciousness, Satori names the moment that consciousness shifts, the instant the door opens. And it was to Satori that Suzuki devoted more pages, more energy, and more rhetorical skill than to any other subject across his entire career. He described it as a kind of breaking open. Not a gradual softening or a slow dissolution of old habits, but a sudden rupture. The student works for years, sits for thousands of hours, carries the koan like a stone lodged in the chest, every day the weight of it pressing against the ribs of the mind. And then, without warning and without any sense that the moment was approaching, the walls come down, the dualities that structure ordinary experience, subject and object, self and world, knower and known, inside and outside. These distinctions do not dissolve gently, the way fog lifts in the morning. They collapse, suddenly and completely, like a floor giving way beneath you, and what remains is not a new thing to be grasped, not a vision to be interpreted, not a message from a higher power. What remains is the absence of the very framework through which grasping was possible. The self that was searching for Satori is itself what prevented it, and when that self, for even a moment, stops maintaining itself, what was always underneath it is simply there, Suzuki insisted, again and again across decades of writing, that Satori was not a trance, not a hallucination, not an overflow of emotion or a neurological anomaly. It was, he said, the most natural and ordinary thing in the world, like seeing the colour of the sky, and also the hardest thing to see, precisely because it is so close, so obvious. So unremarkable when it happens that the mind, trained to look for the extraordinary, refuses to recognize it. What made Suzuki's treatment of Satori so influential and so strategically important to his larger project was his decision to place the Zen experience in direct conversation with the Western mystical tradition. He compared Satori to what Meister Eckhart had described in his medieval German sermons. The moment when the soul releases all images, all concepts, all attachments, and encounters what Eckhart called the Godhead. Not God as a person or a being, but the ground of being itself, the emptiness from which everything arises. He cited William James, the great American psychologist and philosopher, who had catalogued mystical experiences from across cultures and traditions in his landmark book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. James argued that these experiences, regardless of cultural context, shared four defining qualities. Ineffability. They cannot be put into words. A noetic quality. They carry a sense of deep knowledge or insight. Transiency. They are brief. And passivity. The experiencer feels that something is happening to them, rather than something they are doing. Suzuki agreed with the description. He disagreed with the implication that these experiences were exceptions to normal consciousness. Rare flowers that bloomed in unusual circumstances. In Zen, he argued, Satori is not an exception. It is what consciousness actually is when it stops obstructing itself. The mystical experience is not a peak, it is the ground. This cross-cultural comparison was deliberate, and it was brilliant. By showing that Satori resembled what the greatest Western mystics had always described, Suzuki made Zen feel familiar, not foreign, not exotic, not alien, familiar, like a homecoming to something the West had always known, but had buried under centuries of rationalist construction and institutional religion. The philosophical implications of this framing were enormous. If Satori is a universal human experience, if it is the same thing that Eckhart saw and James catalogued and the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing groped toward, then Zen is not a Japanese religion. It is not an Asian religion. It is a human capacity, one that Japan happened to cultivate with unusual clarity and discipline, but that belongs to no single nation, no single tradition, no single culture. This made Suzuki the most successful cross-cultural religious thinker of the 20th century. It also placed an almost unbearable weight on the word Satori itself, because by making Satori universal, he had also, inevitably, made it seem simple, and simplicity, in the hands of an audience desperate for liberation, has a dangerous tendency to become distortion. He had written about what cannot be written about more eloquently than anyone alive. But history was about to test whether any of it was true. Not in a monastery, not in a lecture hall, on the battlefields of Asia, and in the silence of his own home. Through the 1930s, a different kind of transformation was overtaking Japan, and it had nothing to do with enlightenment. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931 was the first unambiguous signal. The Japanese Kwantung Army, acting largely on its own initiative, seized control of the vast Chinese territory and established the puppet state of Manchukuo. The civilian government in Tokyo was too weak and the military too popular to reverse the action. It was a point of no return. Within 6 years, Japan had launched a full-scale war against China. By 1941, it would strike Pearl Harbor and plunge into war with the United States and the Allied powers. At home, the military government demanded total ideological conformity. Schools were reorganized around ultranationalist curricula. Textbooks were rewritten. Art, literature, music, and religion were pressed into service of the state. The concept of kokutai, the idea that Japan was a unique national body with a sacred mission, became the unchallengeable foundation of public life. Dissent was not merely discouraged, it was crushed. Journalists were imprisoned, academics were fired, peace activists disappeared. And Zen? Zen did not resist. This is the fact that is hardest to reconcile with everything Suzuki had written about emptiness, compassion, and the dissolution of the ego. The Japanese Zen establishment, with very few individual exceptions, supported the war effort. The support was not passive or reluctant. It was often enthusiastic and organizational in its scope. Temple leaders gave sermons on the spiritual value of military sacrifice. Some monasteries held formal ceremonies to bless soldiers departing for the front lines in China and Southeast Asia. Zen training methods, originally developed over centuries to cultivate meditative awareness and compassionate insight, were adapted systematically for military purposes. Teaching soldiers to suppress fear, to override the instinct for self-preservation, to approach the act of taking another human life with the same calm detachment that a monk brings to seated meditation on a winter morning. The concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior, was revived from its largely dormant state and promoted by military ideologists as the spiritual soul of the Japanese fighting man. And the text that connected Bushido to Zen, that described the swordsman's no mind and the archer's egoless release and the samurai's capacity to face death without flinching, were readily available. Some of these texts had been written or popularized by D.T. Suzuki. Suzuki's own position during these years occupies a zone of ambiguity that historians have never been able to resolve to anyone's satisfaction. He did not write military propaganda of the kind that some of his contemporaries produced. He did not bless troops at departure ceremonies. He did not give radio addresses urging citizens to sacrifice for the emperor. He was not, by any reasonable definition, a militarist, but neither did he speak against the war. Not publicly, not in his writings, not in any surviving correspondence. His published works from this period, particularly Zen and Japanese culture, and his essays connecting Zen to the samurai tradition and the martial arts, contained passages that could be, and were, read as philosophical justifications for the warrior ethos the military was promoting. The philosophy of emptiness was being used to fill men with a very particular kind of purpose, the purpose of dying without hesitation, the purpose of acting without the encumbrance of individual moral judgment. And the man who had done more than anyone alive to articulate that philosophy in terms the world could understand said nothing, not a word. What exactly did Suzuki write and say during the war years? And what did he leave unsaid? The questions matter because Suzuki was not a minor academic, not a regional teacher whose opinions reached a handful of students. By the late 1930s, he was the most internationally recognized Japanese intellectual in the world. His books were read in English, German, and French. His name was known in universities from London to Chicago to Berlin. When Suzuki published something, it carried authority far beyond the walls of Otani University. And when he was silent on a matter of immense moral consequence, that silence carried weight as well. The most controversial material comes from his writings published throughout the 1930s and earlier. In Zen and Japanese culture, he wrote at length about the historical relationship between Zen Buddhism and the samurai warrior class. He described, with evident intellectual admiration, the swordsman's ability to act from a state of no mind, to engage in combat without the interference of conscious deliberation, to face the opponent and death itself with the equanimity of a person sitting in meditation. Decades later, The scholar Brian Victoria would argue that passages like these constituted intellectual support for Japanese militarism, whether Suzuki consciously intended that support or not. Victoria's reading was careful and documented. He placed Suzuki's words alongside the rhetoric of military ideologists and nationalist propagandists, and showed how easily the philosophical vocabulary of emptiness, detachment, and egoless action could be repurposed as the spiritual language of imperial obedience. Suzuki's defenders have pushed back with equal force and considerable evidence of their own. They argue that Suzuki was describing a historical relationship between Zen and martial culture, not endorsing its contemporary weaponization, that his writings on the sword were about consciousness, about the nature of skilled action under extreme conditions, not about the rightness of Japan's imperial wars. That Victoria selectively quoted passages and stripped them of their broader philosophical context. The truth, as is almost always the case when intelligent people find themselves living through terrible times, probably inhabits a place that is uncomfortable for both sides. Suzuki was not a militarist. He was also not a resistor. He wrote about no mind and the sword because these subjects genuinely fascinated him. They fascinated him long before the military co-opted them, and they continued to fascinate him long after. He may not have foreseen how easily his philosophical language could be weaponized, or he may have understood the risk and judged that the intellectual integrity of his work was more important than controlling its political interpretation. What is beyond dispute is that he was not alone in his silence. Virtually the entire Japanese Zen establishment supported the war effort in one form or another, some actively, some passively, some with sermons and ceremonies, some with nothing more than their failure to object. Suzuki's silence was not exceptional. It was the norm. But because his voice had carried further than any other Zen teacher's, because his words had reached more minds across more borders, his silence echoed with a particular intensity that the silence of obscure temple monks did not. The war would end. The dead would not return, and Suzuki would carry this unbroken silence with him across the Pacific into the lecture halls of the very country that had dropped the bombs, a country that was now impossibly, desperately asking him for peace. To understand the controversy, you have to look at the actual words, not summaries of them built from secondary sources, not accusations assembled on top of them, not defenses constructed around them. The words themselves. On the page, in their original context. In Zen and Japanese culture, Suzuki wrote about the swordsman's experience of no mind with a vividness that is difficult to read neutrally in the aftermath of the Second World War. He described the moment of combat as a kind of spiritual exercise. The sword moves, the body follows. The mind is empty of calculation, empty of preference, empty of the distinction between self and other. There is no killer and no killed, only action arising from the void. Read one way. This is a philosophical description of a meditative state applied to a martial art, an observation about what happens to consciousness under conditions of extreme focus and physical danger. The same kind of observation a sports psychologist might make about a tennis player in the zone, stripped of the athlete's everyday sense of separate selfhood and operating from a place that precedes conscious decision. Read another way. This is a spiritual justification for violence, a framework that removes moral responsibility from the act of taking a life by dissolving the very categories of subject and object, aggressor and victim, through which responsibility is assigned. If there is no self and no other, then there is no one to blame. If the sword acts from emptiness, then emptiness, not the swordsman, is responsible. And emptiness cannot be held accountable. Both readings are available in the text, simultaneously. This is the heart of the problem. The language is precise enough to sustain a careful philosophical interpretation and evocative enough to be co-opted by those who need it for entirely different purposes. Suzuki wrote for an audience of philosophical readers. His words were received by an empire at war. There is a broader question buried here, one that extends well beyond Suzuki and well beyond Japan. Can any thinker control the interpretation of their own ideas? Does a philosopher bear responsibility not only for what he writes, but for what his readers choose to do with it? Marx did not build the gulags. Nietzsche did not design the concentration camps. And Suzuki did not bless the kamikaze pilots. But in each case, ideas that were formulated as instruments of liberation were repurposed as tools of destruction. And in each case, the thinkers' defenders and critics have been fighting about the degree of complicity ever since. Suzuki never addressed the question directly, not during the war, not after. When interviewers in later years raised the subject of Zen's relationship to Japanese military culture, he offered responses that were characteristically oblique. Zen, he would say, is beyond politics, beyond ideology, beyond the dualities of war and peace, guilt and innocence, action and inaction. These are all constructions of the dualistic mind, and Zen operates from a place that precedes duality. His critics heard evasion, a convenient philosophical escape hatch that allowed him to avoid moral accountability by retreating into abstraction. His defenders heard consistency. He was saying the same thing he had always said, that the awakened mind does not take sides, because taking sides requires the very dualistic thinking that Satori dissolves. Whether that position represents genuine wisdom or a deeply convenient refusal to take moral responsibility is a question this documentary deliberately leaves with the viewer. The words are on the page. They have not changed in nearly a century. What has changed again and again is what people needed them to mean. And then Beatrice died, and for a while the words stopped mattering at all. On the 28th of June 1939, Beatrice Erskine Lane Suzuki died in Kamakura. She was 60 years old. They had been married for 28 years. There is no way to describe what followed without first acknowledging what had come before. Beatrice had been his editor and his collaborator, his first reader and his sharpest critic. She had co-founded the Eastern Buddhist and helped build it into the most respected English-language journal on Buddhism in the world. She had raised their adopted son, Victor. She had made their home in Kamakura, a place where scholars from Tokyo, travelers from California, and monks from Kyoto all found themselves sitting at the same table, drinking tea and arguing about the nature of consciousness. She had understood him, not the version of him that appeared on book spines and conference programs. The man underneath, the one who had walked into Engaku-ji at 20 with nothing, the one who had sat with Mu until something fundamental cracked open, the one who, decades later, would still grow quiet at unexpected moments and seem to be listening to something no one else in the room could hear. She knew that man. She knew his silences. She knew the difference between the silence that meant he was thinking and the silence that meant he had gone somewhere that words could not follow. And then she was gone. Those who knew Suzuki in the months that followed describe a man in genuine and undisguised anguish. He wept openly. He could not work. The manuscripts on his desk went untouched. The correspondence that had always been answered promptly accumulated in stacks. He sat for long hours in his study, but not the kind of sitting that produces insight or clarity. The hollow kind. The kind where the body is still because the person inside it has temporarily lost the capacity to move. This matters. It matters enormously, not as biography, not as gossip about a famous man's private grief. It matters because this was the man who had written more about impermanence, about detachment, about the acceptance of loss, about the illusory nature of the self, than perhaps anyone alive. He had told his readers in book after book that attachment is the root of suffering, that the self is a construction, that the awakened mind does not cling, that all things arise and pass away, and that clinging to what passes is the fundamental error of human consciousness. All true, all genuinely what he believed, all supported by centuries of Buddhist thought and his own experience of Kensho, and all, in the weeks and months after Beatrice's death, completely beside the point. The gap between knowing something philosophically and living it in the body is the most honest space in all of human experience. Every tradition that has ever tried to teach wisdom has encountered this gap. The Christian who preaches forgiveness and cannot forgive. The Stoic who lectures on equanimity and lies awake in rage. The Buddhist who writes about non-attachment and weeps when the person he loves is gone. Suzuki lived in that gap after Beatrice died. He did not pretend otherwise. He did not perform equanimity for the benefit of his students or his readers or his reputation. He grieved the way any human being grieves when the center of their world is removed, terribly, slowly, without clear resolution or a tidy arrival at acceptance. And if you want to know whether D.T. Suzuki was a fraud or a genuine practitioner, whether his decades of writing about emptiness were sincere or merely clever, this is where you look. Not at his books, not at his lectures, not at the eloquence of his arguments. Here, in the grief, because a fraud would have hidden it. A fraud would have performed the detachment his philosophy prescribed, would have nodded sagely and spoken of impermanence and moved on. Suzuki did not perform anything. He sat in the wreckage and felt what there was to feel. He had lost his father before he could form a memory of his face. He had lost his mother before he could repay what she had given him. He had lost his country to a war he could neither stop nor endorse nor escape. And now he had lost the person who understood him best. The man who taught that there is nothing to hold on to had nothing left to hold. What he did with that emptiness would take more than a decade to become visible. The years that followed were the quietest and most isolated of Suzuki's life. Japan was consumed by war, and the war consumed everything. Suzuki remained in Japan throughout the conflict. His international correspondences were severed almost completely. The postal routes that had connected him to readers, scholars, and friends in America, England, and Europe went silent as the war spread across the Pacific and the Atlantic. The journals he and Beatrice had built stopped reaching their subscribers abroad. He continued his scholarly work at Otani University when teaching was possible, though the university itself was increasingly disrupted by wartime conditions. Students were conscripted, resources were diverted. The intellectual life that had sustained Suzuki for decades contracted to a narrow and lonely channel. Japan itself was becoming unrecognizable. The firebombing campaigns that began in earnest in 1944 reduced vast areas of Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, and dozens of smaller cities to charred rubble. The American B-29 bombers flew at high altitude and dropped incendiary bombs designed to ignite the wooden buildings that made up most of Japan's urban landscape. The fires swept through neighborhoods with terrifying speed. Temples that had stood for 300, 400, 500 years burned in hours. Libraries of irreplaceable Buddhist manuscripts and scrolls were reduced to ash. The physical fabric of the very tradition Suzuki had spent his life interpreting was being incinerated from above. And then came August of 1945. Hiroshima on the 6th. Nagasaki on the 9th. The Emperor's surrender broadcast on the 15th, a voice that most Japanese citizens had never heard before, speaking in a formal, archaic court, Japanese that many could barely understand, telling them that the war was over. that Japan had accepted terms of unconditional surrender, that the unthinkable had happened. In the immediate aftermath, Japan lay in material and spiritual ruin. The cities were flattened, the economy was destroyed, millions of soldiers and civilians were dead. The Bushido ideology that had driven the nation to war and sustained it through years of sacrifice was not merely discredited. It was radioactive, untouchable. The emperor had publicly renounced his divine status. The military was disbanded by the American occupation forces, and the institutions that had fused Zen with the war effort now scrambled to distance themselves from their own very recent past. Temple leaders who had blessed soldiers began speaking of peace. Abbots who had preached the spiritual merit of dying for the emperor fell silent or pivoted toward reconciliation. Suzuki was 75 years old when the bombs fell, a widower, living in a country that had been burned to the ground by the very civilization he had spent his adult life building intellectual bridges to. And yet, in the wreckage, something entirely unexpected began to happen. Letters started arriving again, from America, from Europe. Scholars, writers, artists, therapists, all of them asking the same question, with varying degrees of politeness and intellectual desperation. Could someone from Japan, someone who understood the Eastern tradition of contemplative practice, help them find a way to live in a world that now possessed the power to destroy itself entirely? The irony was almost unbearable. The nation that had dropped the atomic bombs was now reaching toward the bombed nation for wisdom. The civilization that had won the war through material force now suspected it was losing something that force could never replace. And the one name that kept surfacing in every conversation about how East and West might speak to each other was an elderly Japanese widower living quietly in Kamakura, a man who had spent the last 6 years in near total silence. He accepted the invitation. He packed what little he had, and at the age when most lives are winding toward their close, D.T. Suzuki prepared to cross the Pacific one more time. In 1949, Suzuki was invited to attend the second East-West Philosophers Conference at the University of Hawaii in Honolulu. It was his first journey outside Japan since before the war. He was 78 years old. The world he re-entered bore almost no resemblance to the one he had last seen. The conference brought together philosophers from across Asia and the West to explore whether Eastern and Western intellectual traditions could genuinely communicate with each other, whether the gap between them was a matter of language and translation or something deeper and more structural. Suzuki's presence at the gathering was treated as an event in its own right. Here was the man who had been trying to make that conversation possible for more than half a century, arriving at last to see whether any of it had worked. He found an America that was eager to listen, more eager perhaps than it had ever been. In 1950 he travelled to the American mainland. By 1952 he had accepted a position as a visiting lecturer at Columbia University in New York City. The logistics of this deserve a moment of plain recognition. An 81-year-old Japanese man, recently bereaved. Arriving in the country that had firebombed his cities, destroyed his nation's military, occupied his homeland, and dropped nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to teach at one of the most prestigious universities in the country that did all of this, in his second language, about a tradition that the country receiving him had almost no meaningful history with. The context of his arrival mattered as much as the man himself. Post-war America was prosperous, powerful, and deeply uneasy. The Cold War had begun in earnest. The Soviet Union had tested its own atomic weapon in 1949, and the spectre of nuclear annihilation hung over every conversation about the future. American consumer culture was booming, suburbs were spreading, automobiles were everywhere, and yet a growing number of intellectuals, artists, and young people sensed that something essential was missing from the picture. The material abundance felt hollow. The Protestant churches that had anchored American moral life for generations seemed to many to be going through the motions. Freudian psychoanalysis, the dominant framework for understanding the inner life, struck a growing number of its own practitioners as limited. It could diagnose neurosis brilliantly. It was less convincing as a path to genuine liberation. The existentialists in Europe offered unflinching honesty about the absurdity and meaninglessness of modern life. But honesty about meaninglessness by itself was not the same as a path through it. Camus and Sartre could diagnose the disease. They had less to say about the cure. Into this vacuum walked Suzuki, not with answers, not with a program or a doctrine or a set of beliefs, with something America had almost never encountered from a foreign intellectual tradition. Quiet authority, the kind that does not argue for itself, does not promote itself, does not raise its voice. The kind that simply waits, in silence, to be recognized. He was older than most of his students' grandparents. He spoke softly and moved slowly. And within 5 years he would become the most influential religious thinker in America without converting a single person to anything. The seminar room was small, perhaps 30 seats. Suzuki sat at the front behind a simple desk. His English was clear but accented, the product of decades of reading and writing in the language rather than growing up in it. He spoke slowly, with pauses that his students initially found awkward, the kind of pauses where you wonder if the speaker has lost his train of thought or forgotten what he was going to say next. After a few weeks the students stopped wondering. They began to understand that the pauses were the teaching, that what was happening in the silence between the words was at least as important as the words themselves. He did not lecture in the way Columbia professors typically lectured. There were no outlines distributed at the beginning of the term, no reading lists, no formal assignments, no examinations. He told stories. Stories about the ancient Chinese Chan masters. A student approaches the master and asks a sincere question about enlightenment. The master pours tea until the cup overflows. The master holds up a finger. The master shouts. The master walks away without answering. And the student, in that baffled, frustrated, betrayed moment when the expected answer fails to arrive, has a chance. A narrow, flickering chance. To see something about the mind that expects answers. Suzuki posed koans to his students, and then sat quietly while they struggled. He laughed at questions that expected logical responses, not unkindly, but with the unmistakable amusement of someone who has spent 7 decades watching people try to think their way to a place that thinking cannot reach. The list of people who passed through that room between 1952 and 1957 reads like a directory of mid-century American genius. John Cage, the composer, attended regularly. Cage had been struggling for years with the question of how to free music from the tyranny of the composer's ego, from personal taste and deliberate intention. In Suzuki's lectures on emptiness and no mind, he found his answer. If the mind can be emptied of preference, any sound can be music. Silence itself becomes a composition. His piece 433, in which the performer sits at a piano and plays nothing for 4 minutes and 33 seconds, forcing the audience to hear the ambient sounds of the concert hall, the coughing, the shifting of chairs, the traffic outside, was a direct artistic expression of what Suzuki described philosophically. Philip Glass absorbed the idea that repetition and stillness could be aesthetic principles of the first order. Allen Ginsberg, whose poem Howl had shaken American poetry to its foundations, attended and later pursued formal Buddhist meditation practice. Gary Snyder, the poet and environmentalist, sat in Suzuki's lectures before traveling to Japan to train for years at Daitoku-ji Monastery. He would become the living link between the Columbia seminars and the environmental movement. The psychoanalysts Erich Fromm and Karen Horney both pioneers of the Neo-Freudian school, saw in Suzuki's account of ego dissolution a philosophical complement to their own therapeutic work on the neurotic personality. Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk and Catholic mystic, recognized in Satori the same unitive experience described by the Christian contemplatives he had devoted his monastic life to studying. And then there was Alan Watts. Watts attended Suzuki's lectures and took from them something Suzuki could not control. Watts popularized, he simplified. He packaged Zen as a mood, a cultural attitude, a way of being cool about the universe. He made Zen accessible to millions who would never sit in meditation and never wrestle with a koan. Whether this was a service or a betrayal is a debate that has never been settled. Each of these people left that seminar room and built something. Music without melody, poetry without linear sense, therapy without the ego at the center, spirituality without doctrine. They all pointed back to the same quiet room, the same small, elderly man, who insisted, to the end, that he had nothing to give. The question is whether they received what he offered, or only what they were already searching for. The impact radiated outward from that Columbia seminar room in 3 distinct streams, each carrying Suzuki's influence into a different domain of American culture, each transforming what it carried in the process. The first stream was literary. Jack Kerouac's novel The Dharma Bums, published in 1958, brought Zen directly into the mainstream of American fiction. The novel's central character, J.F. Ryder, was modelled on Gary Snyder, who had sat in Suzuki's Columbia lectures before leaving for Japan to train at Daitoku-ji Monastery in Kyoto. Through Kerouac's vivid, restless prose, millions of American readers who would never open a book of Buddhist philosophy encountered the idea that there existed a way of being in the world that did not require ambition, accumulation, status, or the Protestant work ethic that had been the backbone of American moral identity for centuries. You could live simply. You could sit still. You could find meaning in a cup of tea or a mountain trail instead of a career trajectory. Ginsberg's path was different, but equally shaped by what Suzuki had set in motion. His turn toward meditation practice in the 1960s and 70s gave Buddhism visibility within the counterculture as something more than a fashionable pose. He practiced, he sat, he studied with Tibetan teachers. And he traced the origin of his interest back to the atmosphere Suzuki had created at Columbia. The second stream was musical, and it was perhaps the most radical. John Cage's revolution in 20th century music is unthinkable without Suzuki. Cage had been struggling with the most fundamental question a composer can face. How do you create music that is free of the composer's personal taste, free of ego, free of the illusion that the artist is a special person imposing a special vision on passive material? In Suzuki's lectures on emptiness and no mind, Cage found not just an answer, but a method. If the mind can be emptied of preference, then any sound becomes available as music. The hum of a refrigerator, the sound of rain on a window, the silence in a concert hall when no one is playing. His composition 433 was not a joke or a provocation, though many received it that way. It was a koan rendered in musical form. What is music when the musician does nothing? The answer, if you sit with the question long enough, changes everything you thought you knew about listening. The third stream was spiritual, and it was the most diffuse, the most commercially successful, and the most problematic. By the early 1960s, Zen had entered the American vocabulary as a shorthand for a particular cluster of attitudes: detachment, spontaneity, freedom from convention, presence in the moment. Hundreds of Zen centers opened across the United States during the 1960s and 70s. Books on meditation crowded the shelves of bookstores. The word Zen became an adjective applicable to virtually anything: Zen leadership, Zen cooking, Zen gardening, Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance. Suzuki watched this proliferation from the distance of his later years with a feeling that those close to him described as quiet dismay masked by habitual politeness. He had wanted the West to encounter the depth of Zen practice, the rigor, the years of training, the demanding relationship between student and teacher. What much of the West had encountered instead was the aesthetic of Zen, the surface, the mood, the vague sense that if he could just stop thinking so much, everything would be fine. Suzuki had wanted the West to understand Zen. Instead, the West had understood what it needed Zen to be, and by the time the distance between the two became visible, the version that had taken root was already too widespread, too popular, and too commercially useful to correct. In 1957, Suzuki traveled to Cuernavaca, Mexico, to participate in a workshop that would become a landmark event in the intellectual history of both Eastern and Western thought. The gathering was organized by the psychoanalyst Erich Fromm, and it brought together approximately 50 psychiatrists, psychologists, and philosophers for a week of intensive dialogue on the intersection of Zen Buddhism and psychoanalysis. The resulting book, Zen Buddhism and Psychoanalysis, published in 1960, contained substantial contributions from both Suzuki and Fromm. It was a genuinely unusual collaboration. Two men from radically different intellectual traditions. One rooted in the Rinzai Zen of medieval Japan, trained through years of koan practice and seated meditation. The other rooted in the neo-Freudian psychoanalysis of 20th century Frankfurt and New York, trained through years of clinical work with neurotic patients. They met in Mexico and attempted to find common ground between traditions that had never before been placed in direct conversation. Fromm's argument was bold and ambitious. He proposed that psychoanalysis and Zen Buddhism shared a common underlying goal: the liberation of the individual from the unconscious constraints of the ego. For Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, the purpose of therapy was to make the unconscious conscious, to give the patient insight into the hidden forces, the repressed desires and childhood wounds that were secretly governing their behavior. Once these forces were brought into the light of awareness, the patient could begin to choose freely rather than being driven by compulsions they did not understand. Fromm saw in this therapeutic aim a parallel to the Zen project. Both traditions recognize that ordinary human consciousness is, in a fundamental sense, not free. Both recognize that what passes for normal life is actually a kind of sleepwalking. Both aim to wake the individual up. Suzuki agreed, but only up to a point. He acknowledged the parallel, and he clearly enjoyed the intellectual stimulation of the dialogue. But he insisted on a crucial distinction. Psychoanalysis, even at its best and most liberating, operates within the framework of the individual self. It aims to make the self healthier, more integrated, more functional, more capable of love and work, to use Freud's famous formulation. Zen aims at something altogether more radical. Not the improvement of the self, but the dissolution of the illusion that there is a self in the first place. The distinction was subtle, but its consequences were immense. Fromm wanted to repair the prison. Suzuki wanted to show that the prison walls were painted on air. They met in the middle, and the middle produced genuinely illuminating conversation. But the gap between them pointed toward a divide that the Western world would spend the next 60 years trying to bridge, mostly without success. The Cuernavaca workshop also carried a personal dimension that should not be overlooked. Karen Horney, the psychoanalyst who had developed the theory of the idealized self and its role in neurosis, had been deeply influenced by Suzuki during his years at Columbia. She attended his lectures, corresponded with him, and saw in his description of no mind a therapeutic insight that complemented her own work. She died in 1952, before the Cuernavaca meeting, but her influence was present in the room. Several of the attendees had trained under her. Through Fromm, through Horney's legacy, and through the dozens of therapists who attended the workshop and carried its ideas back to their practices, the notion that Eastern contemplative traditions could illuminate Western psychology took permanent root. It became a seed planted in the soil of American mental health care, and within decades that seed produced something Suzuki could never have predicted or desired. Mindfulness, extracted from its Buddhist context, separated from its ethical and communal dimensions, stripped of the demanding framework of monastic practice, and packaged as a secular technique for stress reduction, sold to corporations for employee wellness programs, adopted by hospitals and schools, and eventually delivered, through smartphone applications, to hundreds of millions of people worldwide as a 10-minute guided breathing exercise. The man who spent his life teaching about emptiness had, without intending to, helped create a product. The distance between Suzuki's Satori and a meditation app is the distance between a teacher and what the students decided to remember. It is worth pausing here, near the end of the story, to ask a question that Suzuki himself might have resisted on principle. What did the English-speaking world actually absorb from his life's work? Not what he intended to communicate, not what his books say when read with care and context. What arrived? What stuck? What became part of the permanent furniture of Western culture? The honest answer is both more and less than Suzuki wanted. More, because the Zen vocabulary he introduced became part of the permanent operating language of Western intellectual life. Satori, no mind, beginner's mind, direct transmission outside of scripture. The idea that meditation is not prayer, not worship, but a form of radical attention. These concepts entered the bloodstream of American and European culture so completely that most people who use them today have never heard of Suzuki. They do not know where the words came from. They do not know that one man chose them painstakingly in a room above a printing press in Illinois and in a study in Kamakura. The ideas became invisible precisely because they became universal. Less, because what much of the Western world received was not the full teaching. It was a selection, and the selection had consequences. Suzuki had emphasized Satori over ethics. The dramatic moment of awakening over the daily, unglamorous ethical commitments that Buddhist tradition insists are the foundation of any genuine practice. He had emphasized individual experience over communal practice, the lone student confronting the koan, the solitary moment of breakthrough, rather than the decades of life lived within a sangha, a community of practitioners who hold each other accountable. He had emphasized spontaneity and freedom over the years of rigorous, repetitive, often tedious discipline that every serious Zen practitioner knows is the actual bedrock of the tradition. He had described the lightning strike. He had said relatively little about the years of dark sky that precede it. The result was a version of Zen that appealed enormously to Western individualism, a spirituality you could practice alone. That required no community, no teacher ultimately, no institutional framework, no ethical structure beyond the instruction to be present. A religion for people who did not want a religion. A discipline for people who were suspicious of discipline. A tradition without the inconvenient demands that traditions usually make. Suzuki's defenders argue that he gave the West what it was capable of receiving. That you cannot transplant a tradition whole, like a tree yanked from the earth and dropped into foreign soil. That the first step is always partial, always a simplification, and that depth arrives later, generation by generation, as the culture absorbs more and grows ready for more. There is truth in this. Cultural transmission has always worked this way. His critics counter that Suzuki gave the West exactly what it wanted to hear, which is not the same thing as what it needed. That by stripping Zen of its institutional, ethical and communal framework, He produced something spiritually appealing but ultimately without teeth, a philosophy of liberation that, in its Western form, liberated people mostly from the obligation to take anything seriously. Both readings have evidence. Neither has the final word. Suzuki, in the end, was one man. He could write the books. He could not govern what the readers chose to do with them, and the readers, as readers always do, found in his pages precisely what they were already looking for. He had held up a mirror and called it a window. Whether that was a failure of translation or an act of profound and deliberate generosity depends entirely on what you believe mirrors are for. So we arrive at the question this documentary has been circling since its opening sentences. Did D.T. Suzuki transmit Zen Buddhism to the West, or did he construct something that had never existed before? The answer is both. And the tension between the two is not a flaw in his legacy. It is the legacy itself. Suzuki was not a fraud. His Kensho experience under Soin Shaku at Engaku-ji was genuine, confirmed by a recognized master standing in a legitimate lineage that stretched back through centuries of Japanese and Chinese Zen. He read the classical texts in their original languages: Sanskrit, Chinese, Japanese. He did not work from second-hand translations or popular summaries. He went to the sources and spent years with them. His knowledge of Buddhist philosophy was vast, meticulous, and hard-earned. His intellectual honesty within the boundaries of what he chose to present was real, but he was also a man shaped by specific historical and personal circumstances that no previous Zen teacher had ever faced. He was shaped by the Meiji era, with its campaign to prove that Japanese civilization could stand as an equal beside the West. That impulse, the desire to show that Japan had something of universal value to offer, runs through all of his work like a deep current. He was shaped by his 12 years in Illinois, where he absorbed not just Western philosophy, but also transcendentalism, the theosophical movement's hunger for a universal spirituality that transcended doctrinal boundaries, and the particular American fascination with self-reliance and individual experience. He was shaped by his marriage to Beatrice, a Radcliffe-educated American who understood the Western mind from the inside and who helped him calibrate his writing to an audience she knew intimately. And he was shaped by his own temperament. He was drawn to the dramatic and the experiential. He was drawn to the koan and the breakthrough, the lightning flash of awakening. He was less drawn to ritual, to institutional structure, to the slow, undramatic accumulation of ethical conduct that most Japanese Zen practitioners would identify as the core of their daily practice. When he sat down to write about Zen in English, all of these forces were at work. Every sentence was shaped by them. He chose to emphasize Satori because he genuinely believed it was the heart of the tradition. He chose to downplay ritual because he genuinely believed it was secondary, a skillful means at best and a distraction at worst. He chose to present Zen as universal rather than culturally bound because he genuinely believed that was the deepest truth about it. And he chose to connect Zen to Western mystical traditions because he genuinely believed the connection was real. Every one of these choices was defensible. Every one was also a choice, a framing, an editorial decision made by a single extraordinary mind working under specific historical pressures and personal convictions. The Zen that entered Western culture through Suzuki's books was not a fabrication. It was a genuine part of the tradition. But it was a part, selected and illuminated by a man with his own vision of what mattered most, his own blind spots about what he was leaving in shadow, and his own assumptions about what the West was ready to hear. His Zen became the world's Zen, and the world, as it always does, took what was offered and made of it something the giver could not have foreseen, a counterculture, a mindfulness industry, an aesthetic movement, a vocabulary for therapy, for sports psychology, for corporate management, for self-help books that Suzuki would not have recognized as having anything to do with the tradition he loved. Whether that outcome vindicates Suzuki or diminishes him is a question every person who encounters his work must now answer for themselves. What is beyond argument is that before Suzuki, the English-speaking world had no meaningful language for what Zen described. After Suzuki, it could not stop talking about it. He had built a bridge between two civilizations. The only question that remains is what happened to the river underneath. The living, complex, unruly, contradictory tradition that the bridge was supposed to help people cross, not replace. In the late 1950s, Suzuki returned to Japan. He was approaching 90. The country he came back to had transformed itself yet again, as dramatically as it had during the Meiji era of his childhood, though in an entirely different direction. Post-war Japan was deep into its economic miracle. The bombed cities had been rebuilt with astonishing speed. New concrete apartment blocks and office towers rose where the firestorms had left nothing but ash. Toyota, Honda and Sony were becoming names known around the world. The old feudal values had been buried so thoroughly that a new generation of Japanese young people could barely believe they had ever held power. Bushido seemed as distant as the age of castles and armor, even though the men who had fought and died under its banner were still alive in their 50s and 60s, carrying memories they rarely spoke about. Buddhism had quietly reasserted itself in Japanese cultural life, not as a political force, not as the ideological arm of the state, but as what it had been before the Meiji reformers and the military ideologists had tried to reshape it. A contemplative tradition, a source of aesthetic guidance and philosophical depth, a practice that gave structure to the passage through life and death. Temples were rebuilt, monasteries resumed their training programs, the monks sat again. Suzuki settled in Kamakura, close to Engaku-ji, the temple where he had first encountered Soyen Shaku, where he had sat with Mu for years in poverty and confusion until something broke open. More than 60 years had passed since that young man walked through the gate. Now an old man lived nearby, in a modest house with a garden he tended himself. He continued to write. He continued to correspond with scholars, students, and seekers from around the world. His mailbox was never empty. An American professor would visit one week, a Japanese monk the next. A young student from Germany who had read the essays in Zen Buddhism and travelled halfway around the world to sit in his living room and ask a single question about the nature of consciousness. In Japan, his reputation remained complex. Academic Buddhist scholars respected his learning, but viewed his English-language writings with professional skepticism. They found his presentations of Zen simplified, romanticized, shaped by what Western audiences wanted to hear, rather than anchored in what the source texts actually said. The philologists at Otani and Tokyo University could point to places where Suzuki's translation shaded meaning in directions that favored his argument over textual fidelity. The monks and priests of institutional Zen harbored similar reservations. This man who had never been ordained, who had spent more of his life abroad or in publishing houses and university offices than in meditation halls, who was somehow the most recognizable face of their tradition on the entire planet. It did not sit easily with people who had devoted their lives to the daily practice, the early morning sittings, the years of silent training within the monastic hierarchy. Suzuki seemed genuinely unbothered by any of this. He had passed beyond the age where the opinions of others carry weight sufficient to alter behavior. In his final decade, those who spent time with him described a man who had arrived at a kind of settledness that was different from the dramatic awakening of his books, something quieter, less photogenic, the peace of a person who has done what he was given to do and understands, without needing to announce it, that the work is complete. He was 95 years old and still writing, still sitting, still breathing, and then, one morning in the summer of 1966, he was not. D.T. Suzuki died on the 12th of July 1966 at St. Luke's International Hospital in Tokyo. He was 95 years old. According to those who were with him at the end, his final word was simple. Don't worry. He was cremated, as is customary in Japan. His ashes were interred at Tokiji Temple in Kamakura. Tokiji sits in the hills not far from Engaku-ji, the monastery where a young man from Kanazawa had arrived with nothing in 1891 and been handed a single syllable to hold for the rest of his life. The two temples are connected by a path through wooded hills, the kind of walk a person might take on a quiet afternoon when there is nowhere in particular to be and no one waiting at the other end. Suzuki had walked that path many times. The geography was not intentionally symbolic, but it was fitting. His life had described a great circle, from Kanazawa to Kamakura, from Kamakura to Illinois, from Illinois back to Japan, from Japan to Columbia University, from Columbia back to Kamakura, and now, at the end, the circle closed within walking distance of where it had truly begun. He did not live to see what came next. He did not see the counterculture explosion of the late 1960s, when Buddhist and Hindu ideas became part of the standard vocabulary of American and European youth movements. He did not see the opening of hundreds of Zen centers and meditation groups across the Western world. He did not see the mindfulness revolution, the corporate retreat industry, the therapeutic applications of meditation in hospitals and clinics, or the smartphone apps that would one day deliver guided breathing exercises to hundreds of millions of people who had never heard of the Lankavatara Sutra or the Koan Mu. He did not see the accusations either. He did not see the scholars who would comb through his wartime writings and construct arguments about complicity and silence that he would never have the chance to answer. He died in the ordinary way that every human being dies. One moment the breath is there, the next moment it is not. The body that carried a consciousness for nearly a century becomes still, becomes cool, becomes something other than what it was. For a man who had spent his entire life teaching about emptiness, about the insubstantiality of the self, about the moment-to-moment arising and passing away of all phenomena, there was perhaps nothing more consistent than this, nothing more fitting, no drama, no spectacle, no deathbed revelation that could be carved into stone or printed on the final page of a biography. Just the quiet departure of someone who had spent 95 years insisting that the most important things happen in silence. He left behind more than 100 books in English and Japanese, thousands of letters, a journal that had run for decades, a vocabulary that had entered the permanent consciousness of the English-speaking world, and a version of Zen Buddhism that hundreds of millions of people believe, without knowing where it came from, is simply what Zen is. He also left behind a silence about the war, a silence about the sword, a silence about what he knew and when he knew it and what he chose not to say. And into that silence the critics would soon begin to speak. In 1997, more than 3 decades after Suzuki's death, a book appeared that forced the entire field of Buddhist studies and much of the Western Zen community to confront something it had been carefully avoiding for half a century. The book was called Zen at War. Its author was Brian Victoria, a New Zealand-born Zen priest and academic who had spent years in Japan, training in Zen monasteries and conducting painstaking archival research into the relationship between Japanese Zen Buddhism and the imperial military. Victoria's central argument was devastating in its simplicity. The Japanese Zen establishment had not merely tolerated the war, it had actively supported it. Institutional Buddhism had provided spiritual legitimation for imperial aggression on a systematic and sustained basis. Victoria documented the scope of this complicity with relentless specificity. Temple leaders who had given sermons praising the spiritual value of dying for the emperor, abbots who had led ceremonies blessing soldiers before they departed for the battlefields of China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Zen training methods, originally developed to cultivate meditative awareness and compassion that had been repurposed for military use, teaching soldiers to suppress the instinct for self-preservation, to override fear, to act without the hesitation that moral conscience introduces, to approach the taking of life with the same calm emptiness that a monk brings to seated meditation. And D.T. Suzuki? Victoria devoted significant attention to the man who had given the English-speaking world its understanding of Zen. He quoted passages from Suzuki's wartime-era writings, the essays on the samurai spirit, the passages in Zen and Japanese culture that described the sword as an instrument of spiritual discipline, the language of no mind applied to combat. Victoria argued that these passages, regardless of Suzuki's conscious intent, constituted intellectual support for the ideology of military sacrifice. They provided the philosophical architecture within which violence could be committed without guilt and obedience could be offered without moral resistance. The response was fierce, immediate, and deeply divided. Suzuki's defenders marshalled their counter-arguments with precision. Victoria had taken passages out of their broader philosophical context. He had confused description with endorsement. He had applied retrospective moral standards, shaped by post-war sensibilities, to a man operating within the constraints of wartime censorship and imperial surveillance. They pointed out the things Suzuki had not done. He had not written propaganda pamphlets. He had not participated in troop blessing ceremonies. He had not made radio broadcasts urging sacrifice. His was a sin of omission at most. Silence, not complicity. Victoria and his supporters responded that the distinction between silence and complicity is not as clear as the defenders wanted it to be, that a man of Suzuki's enormous international stature bore a particular responsibility to speak, that the philosophical framework of Zen as a tradition of action beyond moral judgment was itself a form of complicity, whether conscious or not, because it provided exactly the ideological infrastructure that the military needed to train men who could obey without guilt. The debate has never been settled. Scholars continue to argue over the interpretation of specific passages, the degree to which Suzuki's wartime silence was voluntary or coerced, and the fairness of judging a man who lived through extraordinary historical pressures by the moral standards of a later and safer era. Suzuki never answered the charges. He could not. He was dead 31 years before Victoria published his book. He never stood in a room and said, "This is what I meant, this is what I did not mean, this is what I regret, if anything." His silence on the matter, the same silence that had characterized his wartime years, extended beyond the grave, and whether that silence was the ultimate expression of his philosophy, or merely the ultimate convenience of his reputation, is a question that every reader of his work must now carry alongside whatever wisdom they find in his pages. Let us return to where we began, a small room at Columbia University, an elderly Japanese man, 81 years old, speaking softly about something he insists cannot be spoken about. You know more now than you did at the start. You know about Kanazawa, about the gates of Engaku-ji and the syllable mu, about Illinois and the choices made in a room above a printing press, about Beatrice who understood him and whose death tested every sentence he had ever written, about the war and the silence and the sword, about Columbia and the seekers who took what he offered and built from it things he never imagined. And you know about the accusations that arrived after he was no longer alive to answer them. So, what changed because this man existed? Before Suzuki, the English-speaking world had no coherent framework for understanding Zen Buddhism. After Suzuki, Zen concepts were woven into the fabric of Western intellectual life. Psychology, music, literature, therapy, the language of meditation, the idea of mindfulness, the notion that consciousness itself might be the most important frontier a person can explore. All of this traces back, through various intermediaries and dilutions, to what one man wrote and said and taught, and what endured despite his intentions: the simplification, the commodification, the mindfulness apps that deliver guided breathing exercises stripped of Buddhist ethical teaching, the word Zen printed on candles and management consulting brochures. He spent his life offering an experience. The world flattened the experience into a product and sold it back to itself. And what remains unresolved? The war. The silence. The question of whether a philosophy of emptiness can be held accountable for the actions committed in its name. The question of whether Suzuki's Zen was the real tradition or a brilliant reconstruction. And whether that distinction even matters. Here is what stays. Suzuki spent his entire life trying to give the world nothing. That was the teaching. Emptiness. Mu. The dissolution of the grasping mind. And the world could not stop turning it into something. A book, a movement, an industry, a controversy. The distance between what he offered and what the world made of it is the most honest koan of all. He held out an empty hand. The world saw a gift and reached for it. And in the reaching created exactly the thing his life had been devoted to dissolving. Whether that makes his life a failure or a vindication depends on what you think emptiness means. If it is a goal to be achieved, then he failed. But if emptiness is simply what is already here, right now, when the reaching stops and the hand opens, then perhaps the teaching is still happening, in every breath taken without narration. In every moment when the grasping pauses and something older than language is briefly permitted to be. He sat in a room and said nothing. The room changed the world. And somewhere in the space between what he meant and what we heard, Zen is still happening, whether anyone understands it or not. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing to The Long Shadow. We explore the lives that continue shaping the world we live in, and I am curious. What part of D.T. Suzuki's story changed how you see him? Let me know in the comments.